Hello everybody and welcome back to World of Warships with Wadres, and today's video is being done a little bit differently. I am actually doing my voice recording in the match such as it is that I'm showing you, primarily because I'm kind of wanting to showcase a couple of things that I think would be, well, maybe just a little bit of a interesting concept in regards to the Battlecruisers in World of Warships. And I think I may have actually just made a little bit... Oh, okay, good. I didn't destroy it outright. But, okay. That aside, I'm actually taking my Alaska, and shortly I'm also going to take my Scharnhorst into battle against varying levels of opponents, and just seeing where they compare roughly as far as overall firepower, so on and so forth. Because one of the things that I was thinking about... Ooh, nice hit on that Minakaze. I was thinking about having a pseudo-compromise, I guess you could say, put into the matchmaking system regarding the Tier 9, or just about any battlecruiser for that matter. And, well, some of you may disagree, others may fully agree. It's entirely up to you. I just figured I would put it out there as a possibility and let you all decide whether or not it is something that would be even worth considering. And that is, well, I've been thinking about the battlecruisers as they exist right now, and I think they would actually benefit from having a varied matchmaker, as opposed to a straight-up matchmaker like normal ships, where the battle cruisers can actually have a kind of mixed matchmaker setup, where, okay, sure, you've got the cruiser matchmaker, which takes them down to Tier 7 and up to Tier 9 in the case of the Alaska, the Azuma, the Khronstadt. But they can also be matched in a battleship slot as a battleship at Tier 7, which would admittedly allow them to see down to Tier 5, and I would argue seeing no higher than Tier 8 as a actual battleship being slotted again in a battleship's position. And I was just thinking about this very recently, and one of the things that I'm kind of doing here is just comparing the amount of damage that I am doing to other ships with these 305mm guns on the Alaska, and just basically kind of thinking to show that the amount of damage is comparable in some ways to a Tier 7 battleship if she were mounted as again, a Tier 7 battleship. So I'm actually going to be running some matches here. I mean, this match here is against Tier 5s, which would be like the lowest tier she would be able to see. And the next match is going to be from the standpoint of Tier 7 up to Tier 9. And then I'm going to go back and do the same matchups with the Scharnhorst, or I might even just go straight to the Scharnhorst after this match against the Tier 5s, just so that I have to spend less time reconfiguring the actual match setup, and just basically show you that there are good candidates for having a decent matchmaking spread that is dependent on how they are classed when they are matched. Now, this match is done. Give me 1 minute to set up the next one. Okay. So, now that I am set up in the Scharnhorst, we're going to see how she performs in regards to her damage against the same targets, Tier 5s. And one of the things that I do quickly want to specify before any real engagement actually gets going here is that I have not really done anything special to specialize either of these commanders. Now, granted, I have a commander that is built specifically for my Scharnhorst and is always on my Scharnhorst, but the Alaska, I don't think I actually had my Massachusetts commander on the Alaska in this particular setup. So the commander that would have been on the Alaska is actually the one who came with it, who has 3 skill points, and I don't think I've actually... In fact, I can guarantee that I have not actually spec'd that commander really for anything. I have not used any of those 3 skill points at all. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, is that I have very much decided to show these ships from the standpoint that I'm just pulling them out of my port. I'm not trying to min-max them for anything at all, and just wanting to see how they perform. And also keep in mind that the Scharnhorst has like 256mm guns, so her guns aren't going to have the same single salvo firepower as the Alaska does. But they do reload relatively quickly, and I mean, that Kirov just didn't even really stand a chance against the Alaska, and sure as hell does not stand a chance against the Scharnhorst unless I were to make some mistakes and, say, run into a line of torpedoes from her. Now, obviously, I am not doing this as a honest match where they're shooting back at me, but again, I'm just kind of doing this more as a damage comparison against the enemy ships as opposed to their capability of fighting back against me. But also with that in mind, I believe the armor profile of the Alaska is actually still substantially lighter than that of the Scharnhorst by comparison. So that's just one of those things to keep in mind, is that the Alaska does have a worse armor profile than the Scharnhorst does. But the Scharnhorst is meant as a straight-up battleship, meant to handle like a battleship, meant to be treated like a battleship, and you can actually get some cruiser-esque performance out of her if you spec her captain right, or even just use the right module upgrades on her. Whereas the Alaska, her armor profile might be a little bit weaker, but she does have slightly larger guns that hit a little bit harder than the Scharnhorst, and overall, her performance otherwise, I mean, I believe they get up to roughly similar top speeds. I could be wrong. And just their overall firepower is relatively complementary, I think. Aside from the fact that the Scharnhorst is still classified as a solid battleship with a battleship's armor profile, instead of... She just happens to have more cruiser caliber guns as opposed to the Alaska, which has more battleship-esque caliber firearms. Or, well, I can't exactly say firearms now, can I? But battleship-sized ordnance, to be more specific. And of course, I am also looking at this from the standpoint that the Scharnhorst is still a German battleship, and I do have respect for secondaries, which also helps with her close-range damage output relative to that of the Alaska, and of course the Scharnhorst also has torpedoes, which is another consideration to take into mind. And just to kind of point out what I'm talking about here with the armor profiles, granted the Scharnhorst is a little bit of a different story even in regards to battleships. Primarily, most Tier 7 battleships have basically 25mm of bow armor, I believe, just as a general rule of thumb, or 25mm of bow armor, even. I mean, King George V has 25, Scharnhorst has 25, the Hood has 25, so it's a pretty... 25mm is a pretty standard thickness of armor for Tier 7 as far as battleships go. Then you pull up the USS Alaska, which, give me a second to find that little selector again. There we go. And, okay, yeah, she's got 27 millimeters of bow armor, which means she can tank most battleship shells at Tier 7, up to and including, what, 14 inches? She still can't contend with 16-inch like you see on, say, the Colorado, I believe, and the Nagato. But also take in mind that her armor belt is substantially weaker than that of most Tier 7 battleships. So where you're getting the benefit of better bow armor, you are losing the more substantial strength of the actual armor as her broadside. So she's weaker to broadside damage than if she were facing off against, say, than if an equal tier, a Tier 7 battleship were facing off against a similar target. She is still relatively strong by comparison to cruisers at Tier 7, but that's just one of the things that's going to have to be taken into consideration in regards to even just proposing this in the first place. Okay, so back now in the Alaska, this time for the Tier 7 trial. I have myself set up against a Gneisenau, a Helena, a York, and a Mahan. So 4 versus 1 instead of 3 versus 1. But again, the enemy ships are not armed. They are just mobile. And unfortunately, I actually meant for this to be a standard battle, but I kind of goofed and it ended up being a domination. But overall, it's not really the battle mode, I think, that matters so much as the actual, I guess I could say, the capabilities of the ship against the others. Now, I am looking at the Gneisenau somewhat broadside at long range. Figure leads right about there. And not bad, 2,900 damage. Let's see, York coming in right there. Now, keep in mind that as a Tier 9 cruiser, the Alaska could see down to Tier 7 as a cruiser, so these are targets that she is already capable of facing in the client as it is. And also, these are ships that the Scharnhorst faces on a regular basis.
Target penetrated.
So I figured this was my good baseline as well for showing off her capabilities in regards to being more of a light battleship in the Matchmaker, as far as her potential for a, I guess you could say, split battleship or cruiser matching setup. And also because, well, most of these ships, even a lot of the Tier 5s, I mean, I've looked through, briefly through some minor historical records and noticed that there are still several Tier 5 ships that the Alaska was still contemporary with, up to and including Omaha-class cruisers. I mean, they're granted they were more supporting roles by comparison to a lot of other ships, especially the more modern ships by that point in time, but the simple fact remains that she could have been placed with them in some ways as almost, I could say, a capital ship, as a fleet command ship, with a lot of the Tier 5, the lower tier ships, as they exist in Wargaming at least. So that is one of the things to kind of keep in mind as well. And, oh, damn, I just smacked that Mahan real hard, didn't I? But also keep in mind that a ship like the Scharnhorst, the Colorado, could just as easily do that with a well-placed high explosive salvo, just like the Alaska could. The Alaska just has slightly better accuracy with lower caliber guns. I mean, even the Scharnhorst still has the capability with all of her 256mm guns to do that same thing to a Tier 7 destroyer. And the other thing that I've got set up with the whole having the enemy ships moving around is that I don't want them to just be optimized targeting setups. I want them to actually have angles. I want them to be moving around and me having to either chase them down or dealing with armor angling, trying to catch up and move around them as well. Just because I wish to showcase the fact that this ship obviously will not have the optimized or optimal matchups, optimized positioning that I could bring in just by having the ships sit in one place and shoot at them that way. So, I mean, I want to show that this ship is still very capable of being a Tier 7 battleship equivalent as opposed to a Tier 9 cruiser. And that's just... I think this is something that the other ships like the Khronstadt and the Azuma could benefit from as well, especially after seeing a couple of videos today regarding the Azuma's armor profiles, where she is honestly more similar to a Tier 7 battleship in her armor profile even than the Alaska is, having only 25mm bow plating, which is also another part of where my actual proposal in this regard is coming from. Because if the Alaska can take on at Tier 7, Tier 5, maybe the Azuma would also benefit from being able to seed down to those tiers. In fact, from what I've heard, while she would still take substantial amounts of damage, given that her armor profile is still closer to that of a Tier 7 battleships than that of a, Tier 9 cruiser, the simple fact remains that she can still basically perform very similar to a Tier 7, Tier 6, Tier 5 battleship in most respects. Now, I am not testing this out with the Khronstadt. The Khronstadt, I believe, would be very similar again to the Alaska, to the Azuma, in regards to overall performance characteristics. And just, I think that it would be interesting to see if this is something that Wargaming even stumbles across as far as just my video thoughts or whatever, and maybe something that they could consider doing for these ships that don't really have defined roles. Because again, the Battlecruisers are, they have battleship-esque capabilities, and they were in some ways meant to be almost... They were basically meant to fill the roles of battleships without having to have a battleship present. And this is also something that could be possibly taken into consideration with the HMS Hood, which was also more of a cruiser than she was a battleship in regards to her armament and armor profile. Now, I realize that there are also better ships that I could be choosing for the battleship example as well in regards to this match, but I want to kind of put out the point that the Scharnhorst is still considered a battleship, despite the lighter caliber of her guns, and that is also something to take into consideration, though, is that a regular battleship at Tier 7 is going to have a heavier salvo, again, more comparable to the Alaska than the Scharnhorst. But the Scharnhorst is still very much capable of dishing out damage, and the Alaska is actually dishing out more damage per salvo than the Scharnhorst does. In fact, the Alaska, for single salvo damage, is probably more comparable to that of any of the other Tier 7 battleships, except that she has better accuracy. And that is where I also have to look at some compromises that may have to be made. Could a variable matchmaker be implemented? For example, she could have, again, variable matchmaker, but also variable accuracy to compensate for how she is matched. And what I mean by this is, if she is matched as a battleship, the Alaska would probably need to receive some sort of an accuracy nerf on her guns, make her guns behave more like that of a battleship instead of a cruiser. But if she gets matched as a cruiser, she would get her current accuracy stating back and be able to fill that Battlecruiser-esque role with the higher caliber guns, but still basically be as she is right now. Now, I realize that this is something that would be difficult for Wargaming to, I guess, balance in some regards. In fact, I'm sure it would be. But again, the Alaska is a ship that could play a fleet leading role as a battleship, but in the presence of other battleships, still basically just be nothing more than a substantially heavier cruiser than most others. See, the other issue that I'm dealing with the Scharnhorst is that she does have weaker caliber guns, but I'm not going to really see anything at Tier 7 aside from the Scharnhorst that is comparable, or even just remotely comparable, in penetration capability of the guns to the Alaska. So that's one of the things that I've also been kind of taking into consideration when I was thinking about how to present this idea, and decided on the Scharnhorst as my example. The Alaska's guns behave far more in the same way as that of a Tier 5 battleship with their overall caliber, and the Azumas are probably very similar in that regards. Whereas the Scharnhorsts unfortunately still do behave more like cruiser caliber guns, being that they are 250 something millimeters. But as regards to just general armor penetration and so on, the Scharnhorst is probably a closer example to the Alaska than if I were to actually be going at all of this in a Tier 7, in an actual Tier 7 battleship, or any other Tier 7 battleship for that matter, which has 14-inch guns at substantially larger calibers. And you'll also notice that I am making a point of not using the Scharnhorst's torpedo systems either, because I wish to showcase the guns again. That the guns are the defining point. Now, if I were to start using the torpedoes, the Scharnhorst could definitely level the playing field with the Alaska very, very easily. Especially in regards to the close combat capabilities and just getting damage out there on the enemy ships. And that's one other thing to take into consideration as well, is that if I start using the torpedoes, I start losing some of my comparison, though, because, again, the Scharnhorst's guns are good. They are definitely capable of dishing out damage, but what really sets her apart, again, even as a Tier 7 battleship, is her lighter caliber guns, but she also has torpedoes. Granted, the Gneiss now has torpedoes as well, but she also loses a lot of that capability in regards to just the German accuracy, so to speak. and that's something else to keep in mind. And you'll also notice that at the Tier 5 ships, I was primarily just, with the exception of going up against the Koenig that I had slated, I was still perfectly happy just using HE, even in the Alaska, as well as the Scharnhorst. Whereas getting up into Tier 7, I do have to start consider switching around between HE and AP, just in order to keep the damage output going, especially against the heavier targets like the Gneisenau. But the HE is still very, very viable as a ordnance loadout, just because it is still reasonably powerful. I can guarantee that if I were to go into these same matches with, say, my Buffalo, I would be hurting a little bit more. If I were to go into these matches with the Missouri against the Tier 5s, there would be no contest. But with the Alaska, she is very, very much... I think her balance is very similar to that of Tier 7 battleships, aside from just having that slightly better accuracy, which sets her apart as a battlecruiser as opposed to a battleship. And if she were to be matched as a battleship, would probably need to be nerfed just, again, ever so slightly to not give her too much of an edge against other Tier 7 battleships. And again, she could still also be matched as a Tier 9 cruiser, seeing up to Tier 10, but again, the variability in the matchmaker would be there, where she could see and receive a lot of playability relative to where she is matched. I just think it would make for an interesting concept in handling the battlecruiser question, because again, they don't quite fit the battleship description, but they're also not quite cruisers. They're still they're heavier than most cruisers, and they're lighter than most battleships. And the Alaska, again, her armor, her guns are at least competent for handling at Tier 7. That much is for sure. Her armor profile is also equivalent, again, to that of most Tier 7 battleships, by what I have been seeing. Granted, I have not quite compared her to the Nagato, but, I mean, I don't think the Nagato even has armor above 25 or 27 millimeters, so there is that to consider as well. Again, I just think it is an interesting concept in regards to where the Alaska could be handled.
Wir haben einen gegnerischen Zerstörer versenkt.
And not just the Alaska, mind you. I'm also, again, talking about the Khronstadt and the Azuma. So, and it would give them a lot more playability, and I think it would make for a nice, unique trait, especially if battlecruisers are something that is potentially going to be introduced as maybe, say, a full tech line or something later on. Again, I know nothing in those regards. I know nothing in regards to World of Warships plans, or even Wargaming's plans in regards to putting out battlecruisers as anything at this point. But it would be an interesting concept for them to build into them if they do decide to move forward with battlecruisers as a whole. Now, one thing that I will, again, have to say to keep in mind regarding this proposal at all would be that for a variable matchmaker to be implemented, there are some changes that would need to be made in order to make it viable. First off, any cruiser that could technically be classified as a very heavy cruiser Battlecruiser, so on and so forth, that would benefit from this variable matchmaker would need to have the following considerations taken into account in regards to how they are matched. If they are matched as battleships, and this would be a completely separate criteria, and it would also have to be stated in their actual specs in the port, so this is something that Wargaming would really have to work on. If they were matched as cruisers, they would be able to have their current standing in regards to armor profile, or not armor profile, but their main gun accuracy. Their detectability probably wouldn't need to change much, but their maneuverability might also need to take a little bit of a hit in just regards to just rudder shift or whatever. Wait. Sorry, I got myself backwards. What they would need to take into account for cruisers. The cruisers would basically be able to stay as they are, as if they were matched as cruisers. That's one thing. Where they would have to change things up dramatically is if they got matched as battleships. To be matched as battleships at the lower tier to also give them not too much of an advantage, especially against, say, Tier 5 battleships or against Tier 5 cruisers, they would likely need to receive a range or damage nerf, or quite simply because these guns are reasonably decent relative to other battleships at Tier 7. Instead of nerfing the damage output or the range, what they could do instead is just nerf the accuracy, where if matched as a battleship, they receive battleship accuracy at Tier 7, Tier 5, so on, just to make sure that they do not overperform as battleships relative to other battleships. And this would also, of course, take into consideration having the reload time nerfed just ever so slightly as well, to be again on par with other Tier 7 battleships. And, I mean, keep in mind that most Tier 7 battleships could probably do that just as easily to a Neptune as I just did. The Z-46 is still... It's in that threshold with the Alaska where the shells do not stick in the ship and cause full damage. That's one of the other things to have in mind, is that these are still basically battleship caliber guns, and they will behave against lighter targets, like destroyers, like, in some ways, light cruisers, in very similar fashion to that of battleship guns. And please forgive any noise you're hearing in the background. My cat is apparently playing with something in the water dish. Not sure if that's even going to come across in the actual audio feed, but it just in case it does, I apologize as we speak. Now, something else that would probably need to be removed from the Alaska, the Khronstadt, and the Azuma, granted I don't know offhand what consumables the Azuma has access to, but the Alaska would also, if she were matched as a battleship, need to lose access to her radar consumable, so that she would not be too powerful against, say, Tier 5 destroyers. Granted, at least no more powerful than she is if she just uses her guns on a normal standpoint. So that is something that would also need to be taken into consideration as well, is just have her... She would need to lose access to the radar at Tier 7. So that is... I don't know if that's something that players would be willing to lose to have her potentially matched as a Tier 7 battleship. But again, it would probably be a good thing for her to lose to be able to seed down to those lower tiers and just excel as a capital ship.
Enemy battleship destroyed.
I am still kind of going to want to showcase the Scharnhorst against the Tier 9s here, so I am going to move on with the video with the matches, but I think I've kind of run out of the points that I want to make, the things that I want to say, so you will forgive me if I go kind of quiet at this point and just kind of let the battles as they are speak for themselves. It also looks like I'm going to have to chase down this stupid little Z-46. Although, what am I thinking? At Tier 9, she would be matched as a cruiser, so I would still be able to use the radar anyway, so I have no qualms in actually using this radar against the Z-46 just to get eyes on it. There we go. And she's starting to move forward already, damn it. Okay.
Enemy heavily damaged. Enemy destroyer foundered.
The one note that I will make in regards to the Tier 9 match with the Scharnhorst is that I am actually going to resort to using the torpedoes against the Tier 9 bracket, just because at Tier 9, the Scharnhorst's firepower is just far too anemic in regards to these guns to actually do, dare I say, consistent damage to Tier 9 battleships. So yeah, I do kind of have to level the playing field a lot, especially against something like, the Azuma, to even just level the playing field and show off the comparison a little bit better in regards to the Alaska there.
gegnerischer Kreuzer zerstört.
I will state, though, that I really only intend to use the Scharnhorst torpedoes specifically against the Azuma unless this rune gives me too much trouble.
Wir haben einen gegnerischen Zerstörer versenkt.
Wow, okay, that just sucked.
Gegnerisches Schlachtschiff gesunken.
I suppose one of the other things I could say in regards to choosing the Scharnhorst over some of the other Tier 7 battleships, I mean, okay, granted the Gneisenau is a little bit of a different story as well, but it's because she does have that 70mm lower strip of bow plating, which in that regard, at least for the matches that I'm showing you, would probably make her relatively comparable, at least in regards to her bow armor, in relation to the Alaska. Granted, she can still tank, with that 70mm strip, she could probably still tank Yamato's shells. But in regards to, against the, even just the 14 or whatever shells, granted I'm not actually being shot at, it is at least reasonable to make that comparison, because the Scharnhorst could easily bounce 14mm shells, or no, 14-inch shells, and still perform adequately. Basically almost as if they weren't even fired at her at all. Same for the Alaska. Anyway, on that note, I suppose, aside from hunting down this rune, I've kind of made my point. So I will kind of say farewell to you all here, let you all go, and wish you all happy hunting, and just enjoy, I guess, finishing, watch me finishing off this rune if I can find it. And just kind of let y'all go from there. The other thing I will say is just kind of offer what I've been saying here in this video a little bit of consideration. Maybe it's something that we could try seeing if Wargaming would be interested in at all, as far as possibility or just moving forward. If it's something that would intrigue them, creating that some sort of variability in ship performance to give them a little bit of a variability in just their overall matchmaking capabilities, especially in regards to the Battlecruisers. Anyway, that's it for now. Hope you all take care. Happy hunting. I'll catch you all next time.